Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us this edition of Leak Project. I am your host, Rex Bear, and tonight's guest is Mark Dwayne Combs, investigative researcher who is fascinated by ancient mysteries, biblical history, and the origins of man. He is an author, public speaker, blogger, and publisher. Check out Mark's website at www.markcombauthor.com. He's also on Facebook and Twitter. And a few years ago, back in 2013, Mark began to focus his attention on motivational writing and speaking. A self-hosted webpage was developed for his weekly blog, Splinter in the Mind's Eye, with plans to composite some of the motivational writing into self-published book form. Now, last year, in January, he published his first book, In the Beginning, a non-fiction critical research volume that examines the possible reality of Noah's Great Flood. 2 additional books in the series are on the horizon, as well as 3 composite volumes of motivational writings. Mark is active in radio, seminars, research, and blogging. Tonight, we are going to uncover the mysteries of Noah's flood. How did Noah build an ark so big that it was able to hold 2 animals of every species? Who helped build it? How long ago was it? Are there more texts, scribes, and ancient stories that speak of a cataclysmic flood? These questions and many more will be discussed tonight here on the Leak Project. Make sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel, youtube.com/clandestine Time Lord. Have access to all the latest podcasts first and free, and pick up a copy of Mark's recent book. Check out his website, markcombauthor.com. Mark, it's great to have you on the show here with us at the Leak Project. How the heck are you?
I'm doing great. Thank you so much for giving me this opportunity. It's a privilege to join you today.
Oh, it's great to have you. I know that many of our listeners are very religious and spiritual, and I've had people before ask me to get more scholars on here that know about some of these past events that are written about in the Bible. So the fact that you sent me this book, which is, just an awesome book, I've gone through it and really enjoy it. How did you get into this type of writing? What was it that made you decide that you wanted to spend countless hours in research into finding out if this flood story is actually legit?
To tell you the truth, it was my own questions and my own concerns that I had with the story. Let's be honest, this is a story that most people are familiar with, the story of Noah and the flood, the destruction of all living things by water, the preservation of life through one man. Usually there's a sense that there's either an external entity, a godlike being, or something along that line involved with the story. There's a sense of judgment as opposed to this just being a natural catastrophe for no apparent reason. But along with that, when you peel back the different layers of the story, there's as many questions as there are answers, and I'm no different than anyone else. I had a lot of serious questions that I felt were worthy of being researched and to go in search of responsible answers for these questions. And that's really the book itself, is kind of my own personal journey through that process.
Right. And so when you started compiling information and data to see what other people or cultures might have spoken about a cataclysmic flood many years ago, where did you start your path?
Well, I think most people start with the Old Testament book of Genesis kind of being a hub. But when you look at the story, there are flood legends in every culture around the world. And depending on the research material that you pick up, there's anywhere from 75 authenticated flood legends to upwards of 200. Depending on who you use as a resource. But the bottom line is it's in every culture. Every culture has a flood legend that kind of follows the same type of storyline. So I looked into some of those, and then I wanted to see what other ancient manuscripts that had preserved through the test of time as full volumes had to say about the story. And as we picked up on some of those, we introduced those as we went through the text. And in each case, as I introduced one of those particular resources, such as the Book of Enoch, which many people are familiar with, or the Book of Jasher, which a lot of people are familiar with, the Book of Jubilees, as I introduced these, I kind of gave the background of where this book came from and why I felt like that it was worthy of being considered as a potential resource for information. I didn't want to just throw something in the text for someone that may be not familiar with where it came from and say, hey, good luck, you go research that on your own. I wanted to walk my readers through the steps of the process of where all of the information in the book came from. And then aside from that, we also wanted to take modern day information that we had through different fields of study, everything from, I used woodworking and forestry resources. I used a lot of different scientific resources. I used a lot of different space, NASA, Universe Today, things of that nature, resources about the solar system as well. I wanted to pull information from every feasible aspect that I could find something that was useful.
I've heard that they've got reports in China that are not reports, but I mean like ancient texts that are over 1,000 years old that talk about some type of global flood. Now, in your book, didn't you say that there was over 500 different accounts of flooding stories that you were able to research?
Yeah, there's from all around. The issue that many people will have with these stories is that not all of them portray it as a global flood where everything was destroyed. So a lot of people will say, yeah, this particular legend or account here refers to a local flood in that area, and in some cases that's true. But as you begin to look at it, it becomes evident that there is a common thread, and that common thread is that at some point in time, every inch of this globe that we call home has been underwater. The question becomes when, and was it underwater all at one time? These legends and these stories that we pull together all tend to build upon each other and kind of complement each other in many various ways.
Well, and you also, I think you've got some statistics in here, if I can just read these off real quick, because I thought this was pretty cool. In 95% of more than 200 flood legends, the flood was worldwide. In 88%, a certain family was favored, and 70% survival was by means of a boat. In 67%, animals were also saved. And then it says here in 66%, the flood was due to the wickedness of man. So that's interesting, those statistics and the connections there.
Yeah, as you study more and more of them, in some cases what you find is that, there was a flood that seems to be of natural causes or cataclysmic, something broke loose, but almost 2/3, as you saw in the statistics there. And this is from a resource that was compiling and layering a lot of these stories to find common themes. Almost 2/3 point to this particular incident as being a result of a judgment from a divine being. And I found that to be rather interesting, that was so widespread and so, kind of underlined in the story that this is a judgment event, not just a natural event that happened. So as I dug into the story, that became an underlying theme. If there is a divine being that is going to destroy the earth, all of the earth, with the exception of one family, and then preserve the animal kingdom, well, why? How bad was man? What did man do that resulted in this being the only possible result is, hey, I've just got to wipe everything out. So that became a underlying theme of the book as to not only how did the flood happen, but why did the flood happen. So I kind of had two themes running throughout the book as we marked from chapter 1 and deeper into the passages of the book. The things that we had to deal with right up front in chapter 1 is the ark itself. It's kind of the central character, even though it's not a character, and it's one that takes an awful lot of scrutiny from those that would be skeptical, and I think deservedly so. I think there's a lot of things that needed to be discovered and related about the ark itself that kind of go unthought through, unmentioned from people on both sides. Those that believe the story believe it without questioning. Those that oppose the story or are skeptics with no real reason for being skeptical because they don't have enough information. They just don't believe it could happen.
Let's jump into the possibility of people being able to build a boat big enough to fit 2 of each animal on the entire planet on there, or let's just say half of the animals. First of all, you'd have to go to the ends of the earth to get them. Mm-hmm. You'd have to go all over the globe. And then the size itself, I mean, if let's just look at the mass, have you ever compiled the data? Okay, you've got 2 zebras here, you've got 2 giraffes here, you've got 2 elephants here, you've got 2 tigers here, 2 orangutans over here. I mean, how much mass and size would you need to put 2 of everything on a boat? And then how would you get rid of all the waste? And how would you feed them all?
And that's an interesting question, and all of those things kind of have to be dealt with. But in looking at it, we have to make sure that we're asking the question correctly. And this is where I kind of relied on what we know in the scientific realm and what we know as far as where the animals we have in the world today came from. And I just took scientific knowledge, footnoted it all for the readers, and dealt with this issue pretty extensively in Chapter 5. The one thing you've got to look at is the population of animals that we have today and where did they come from, as far as how did we develop 150 breeds of horses? How did we develop all these different types of felines, cats, large cats, small cats? We have domesticated cats. We have cats that we're still discovering in different parts of the world that are new species to us. So you've got that in every different type of animal throughout the animal kingdom. And so what I wanted to do first off is figure out, if you were going to flood or have a flood, what animals actually needed to be saved. And so I kind of had to look at that in Chapter 5 and determine what animals would actually have to go on the ark. You wouldn't have to take any animals that could survive in flood waters themselves, such as aquatic animals, insects, and things of that nature, bacteria. A lot of people go, well, we've got all of these different strains and species of things, and there's no room on the ark for it. Well, you can eliminate a large portion of the species of the animal kingdom just by sitting down and looking at the different categories. And that's one of the things that we did in the very opening of Chapter 5, is break the animal kingdom down into the 9 major phylums of animals that exist. And out of that, only a small percentage or portion would have to be preserved. The rest of them would have done just fine. So out of that small percentage or portion that needed to be preserved, the air-breathing, land-dwelling animals, the next thing we wanted to look at is, okay, where did they come from, the animals that we have today? And so I used a website that we cited in the book that's provided by the U.S. government. It's called ITIS, and it's the Intertaxonomical, it's got a very long name, but ITIS is the website, and it breaks down every genre of animal into phylum, species, family, etc., so that you can look at things. The other resource that we pulled was what science tells us, and science tells us that all of the dogs that we have in the world today can be traced back to a specific breed of wolf that existed 30-something thousand years ago in a particular area of the world. Well, if science has done that for us, then I find that as being useful information. The question that I was left with was, how many animals do we need to save, and how far back to the original family tree do we need to go? Because animals produce vast variations within their own species or kind at a very rapid pace, far more rapid than we would think. One of the things that we looked at, aside from dogs, cats, and some other animals in the book, was how fast a certain species of animal could produce variations of that species over a period of time. And what we found and what we noted in the book was that it could be done over a period of just a few generations. You have enough change in a species that now you've got something that is slightly different than what it was just a few generations ago. Probably the most obvious example of that for us is seen in domesticated animals. We have hundreds of breeds of cats and dogs that people own as pets. Those breeds, if you went back just a few hundred years, would be significantly reduced to a far lesser number of breeds. The breeds have expanded because of breeders who have mixed, matched, and paired up animals of the same kind, different dogs, different cats of the same kind, to produce traits that they wanted in an animal. Some produced a smaller breed of dog or a larger breed of dog or a more aggressive breed of dog, but all of those things were by design, and they only took a few generations. And so many times we have the idea that the change within a species takes hundreds of thousands of years. And that's really a misconception, and science teaches us that.
And still, even with that said, though, I mean, it would just take an enormous amount of space and resources to be able to keep that supply going. Have you been able to put, like, because in your book, you've actually got a pretty neat description, and you've got some timetables and such of lifespans and how long certain things took to get put together. But let's go back here for a minute and look at a different possibility. Okay. Now, I've seen ancient astronauts, and if I see something on TV, I more to think it's disinformation, just because I feel like if they tell you something's good, half the time it's bad, you know? I mean, there's so many lies in the media today. But I think that there's a very fascinating possibility with that option, and here's why. Let's say you've never read the Bible before, you weren't raised religious, you didn't have any type of background in, I don't know, any type of Christianity or Abrahamic religion, and then you read the Bible, you would probably look at it much differently than somebody that has had, you know, previous generations where they were very religious, their parents, their grandparents, and raised in that specific atmosphere. So you read the book, and you've got these, you know, you've got Yahweh basically saying, okay, Enoch, you need to go kill, I don't think it was Enoch, I think he had Adam kill 50,000 men, women, and children because he said that, you know, they were corrupt and evil. And I just think that if somebody is an all-knowing God, and if he already knows what's going to happen, why would he create something like that and then make people that are good people go do his bidding by killing off so many people in a very brutal fashion? I mean, can you imagine having to do something like that, what that would do to you personally? I've got friends and family that were in the Iraq War, and I don't know that they had to kill anybody with their bare hands, yet they've got PTSD because they've seen their friends get blown up with weapons, and they're going to have a very tough time mentally dealing with certain situations. So I just think that there's a very interesting story. So when I read that story, I look at it more as if, okay, well, maybe these are two factions that aren't possibly divine. Maybe they're extraterrestrials. Maybe they're people like us, but very far advanced, and they don't like each other, and they're fighting for that piece of real estate. And so, okay, well, people that are here already, and they see these people that come down from another planet, they look at them as gods because of their technology, and they're like, okay, well, you're bad and you're good because you said you were good and you said you were bad. And you usually learn about the history from the victors. So the ark itself, could it possibly be, where I'm going with this, is the ark itself, could it possibly be some type of spaceship that when they said, okay, we took two animals of each species, essentially, they just used the DNA samples to make it a lot more, I guess you could, if you looked at the schematics of something like that, it should be a lot more realistic if those technologies existed, etc. What do you think about that possible theory?
I have got about 6 cans of worms open on my desk right now. That was fascinating. And I'm grinning ear to ear because you brought up so many things that are just things that we're drawn to. Let's be honest, people are drawn to the mysterious. They're drawn to the unknown, to the realm of possibility. once we know how a magic trick works, it no longer captivates us. We're drawn to the things that we don't know and can't figure out on our own. You brought up a very interesting comment with regard to the Bible, and I would have to agree with you. The Bible itself, if you come to the Bible as someone who has never, who didn't grow up being taught the scriptures, who didn't grow up familiar with it, and you just pick up the Bible and start reading, you walk away with two very strong impressions. Number one, this is a very weird book. And number two, there's a lot of things in this book that absolutely don't make sense. And you brought up a couple of those. Now, the problem as folks grow up from the time they are a child in the church and they are taught all of these things, well, they're a part of a group of believers, and so they begin to accept these things without even questioning what they believe. And I think in some aspects, that works to our detriment. There's nothing wrong with questioning what we believe. There's nothing wrong with questioning the facts or the supposed facts that we're looking at. I think that is healthy in every aspect, and I think that brings us to a place of discovery. In fact, I think that's one of the few ways that we can actually discover things, because if we believe we already have all knowledge and understand something, then we tend to reject anything outside of that as being helpful or informative. So I think coming to it from an aspect of, geez, I don't know, this doesn't make sense, what's going on here, is a very healthy aspect and approach to take. Now, to get back, and you brought up a question that I really want to answer, but I'm going to have to leave it on the side, kind of a sleeping dog that I don't want to kick. We're just going to walk by and get to the boat itself, okay? Maybe we'll get back to that sleeping dog a little bit later, because you brought up the killing of a lot of folks and why God would have someone do that and things, and that is just absolutely amazing. And I think that actually factors into our story a little bit. But we'll have to come back to that one, and hopefully, we'll be able to dig into that just a little bit deeper. But I wanted to talk about the boat for just a second, because every visual image that we get of the ark is something that is, we see the human beings, Noah and his sons, I guess, are portrayed artistically as standing near the boat, and the boat is just a little bit taller than them. And there's usually 20 to 30 animals in the picture, and the boat is just filled and bursting at the seams with these animals that are in the picture. And that's kind of the artist's conception. Well, that's also the conception in our mind. And one of the things that I wanted to tackle early on, as I said, the ark is kind of a central character, even though it's an inanimate object, so to speak. It's more of a floating apartment complex than it is a personality. But I wanted to dig into that because it is the elephant in the room that no one really talks about because they think they understand it. And I was pretty sure that I didn't. So the first thing I wanted to look at was the measurements of the ark itself and get an idea of how big it actually was. And the measurements that are given in the book of Genesis is a measurement of a cubit. And that's not something that we typically use. We're used to either feet, yards, meters, or, things of that nature. But a cubit isn't something, no one sells a tape measure that measures off in cubits. So we need something different to go on there. So I actually dug back into some archaeological finds, and Eckhart Unger unearthed a measuring stick in the ancient city of Nippur, which is about 90 miles to the north of present-day Baghdad. And that dates back to about 3000 BC, somewhere in that time period. So I took that particular measuring stick, which does have markings on it and identifies itself as a cubit, and I said, at least that gives us some kind of starting point. Is this Noah's cubit? I have no idea, but it's something that's ancient, and it's something that's well-defined. It's an archaeological artifact that we can at least have a starting point with. Otherwise, the numbers mean nothing. And it translates into approximately 20.4 inches for a cubit. And I took that, did the math that's given for us in Genesis, and the math given for us in Genesis produces a boat that is a little over 500 feet in length, a little over 85 feet in width, and a little over 51 feet tall. Now, I've been told by a lot of people that the Ark is about the size of a football stadium. Well, I don't have a football stadium anywhere near me. And the one that's closest to me, for whatever reason, I don't understand this, but they keep it locked up. Something about security, and I can't just go walk around in the stadium at will. So I needed to find a different type of visual for myself. I'm a very visual person. So I went to the nearest parking lot I could find, and I measured parking spaces. And I know that sounds a little elementary, but parking spaces actually are, when you get to a parking lot, they are very consistent with their measurements as far as they're drawn out, they're painted, and it's kind of like having a giant ruler that you can go by. So I went and I measured the parking spaces, and I kind of got an idea of how many parking spaces I needed to get to this length and this width. And what I found out was that the parking lot I was standing in was too small. So I had to go to another parking lot. I went to one that houses a theater, and it had long, continuous parking spaces that I could actually mark off. And once I had marked that off to the size of just a little over 500 feet, I think it was 510 feet, I could stand in the footprint of the Ark. And then I had an idea of how big this vessel actually would have been as it's Genesis. And it was mind-blowing. It was far beyond my expectations of what I had mentally imagined. The next thing I wanted to look at was height. And the theater we were in the parking lot had a large facade that stretched upward, and I thought, this is a really tall building. So I had my wife take a picture of me standing next to the building in front of the theater. And I'm 6 foot tall, almost even. It's like 6.5 inches. But I took that picture when I got back home, and I began to Photoshop myself and put myself on top of myself over and over. I knew that from the measurements I had, the Ark would have been approximately 51 foot tall. Once I had 6 of me, which is 36 feet, I had run out of building. This building I thought was incredibly tall wasn't representative. It was more than 15 feet short of what I actually needed. Well, once I realized that, I couldn't wait to get back to the parking lot. The bottom line to all this is that in our mind's eye, we don't really appreciate the size of the Ark. And since I've written the book, the one feedback that I've got from folks more than anything else is that they've gone to a parking lot and marked this out, and they're astounded. Because in our mind's eye, in our visual, we have no concept of how big this vessel would have actually been. Now, that's just blueprints, but it doesn't tell us how to go about building it. And I saw that as an issue as well, because if it's built out of wood, I could care less what kind of wood. The wood has to come from somewhere. This wasn't a backyard project that was done on a weekend. This is a massive building project. So I wanted to calculate how much wood would be needed and how much acreage of old growth forest would have to be cut down. And as I began to do that, I was just simply astounded. And I used numbers from the California Forestry Preservation of what they consider the average population of usable trees of a certain size per acre in forest. And I found that we needed over 25 acres of old growth forest just to supply the lumber to build this thing. By the time I got through with my calculations, I was absolutely astounded, and I was back to how could we possibly build this? And I think that's a legitimate question.
Well, and how many people did it take?
That's something that, I've actually debated that with friends and colleagues, because there's some thought that Noah built it himself. Noah and his sons helped him build it. And in my research, I have come across the idea that there was there was alien life forms involved here, that this was a supernatural type of event, that possibly things were preserved through DNA, things of that nature. I've looked at that a little bit. I can see in other research that we don't need that for the story to unfold. It makes for some great speculation. It makes for some great late night discussion, and it might make for a great story for a movie. In fact, I think they kind of did that with Jurassic Park, where they kind of brought everything back with DNA and repopulated an island, and that kind of went left on them real quick. But in this particular story, I don't think it's necessary to have that. I think we can look at the details of the story and see human involvement here and see things that were natural for the world in which we live in today to have occurred. And I think that's entirely possible. Galileo once said, "I do not feel obliged to believe that the same God who has endowed us with a sense of reason and intellect has intended for us to forego their use." And I think sometimes we want to launch beyond what is reasonable in search for an answer that can neither be proved nor disproved. And in doing so, we abandon what may be reasonable answers that are lying right at our doorstep. In my mind, in my research, I really believe that the things I was able to uncover do support the underlying theme that this was a human project that was built by human beings just like you and I, in the same type of a process that we would have built them. Now, the Ark takes a beating when it comes to the question of reality. One of my favorite comments that I've seen, and your listeners may be familiar with a debate that was held a little over a year ago, maybe almost 2 years ago now, between Bill Nye and Ken Ham. And in that debate, Bill Nye actually brought up a lot of valid questions about the Ark, including some that I had going in. So I really appreciated the things that he was bringing to the table. But one of the things that he brought to the table in his presentation was an illustration of a boat that was built in the early 1900s by a group of shipbuilders in New England. And the boat was the USS Wyoming. It was about 300 feet in length. It was a 6-masted schooner, and it had all sorts of problems when they launched it and put it to sea. It would twist in the currents and the waves and the pitching of the sea, and it leaked profusely to the point where eventually the USS Wyoming sank and 14 lives were lost. And Bill Nye used that as an example of how a boat of this size absolutely could not be built, because in our modern day, those who were the most skilled shipbuilders of their day couldn't do it. So therefore, in his reasoning, someone who was unskilled, and there is the assumption that Noah and the people of that time would have been unskilled, that they would have been unable to build a vessel of this size. Well, in my research and a lot of things that I looked at, I put some things in the book. One of the things I came across after the book was published that I've tried to add into interview materials is from the nation of China. About the 1200 AD period, you have a great naval officer named Zheng He. And for those who want to Google this, his name is spelled with a Z. It's Zheng, and the last name is spelled He. It's pronounced Zheng He, but it's spelled a little bit differently than we would say it phonetically. But he captained the great treasure ships of ancient China, circa 1200. Those ships had a large fleet of vessels, many of which were over 300 feet in length. Some were over 450 feet in length, and there were a couple of master ships that were in excess of 600 feet in length. This is all recorded in the ancient history of China. In fact, they have museums that are open for visitors to go and to review that history and the legendary feats of Zheng He and the Chinese treasure ships. They were massively huge. They sailed around the world, and they were made completely of wood. Just because one person couldn't do it doesn't mean it can't be accomplished. And if we look long enough for examples of what can be done, often we'll find someone who has successfully done it. And I think in this instance, we can find what I would deem modern day example of someone who was able to not only build one ship, but fleets of ships that were entirely wooden and seaworthy. So I think when it comes to the question of could the Ark be built, I think the answer is yes, it could be built.
And also, I'm looking at the Doomsday Mount Noah's Ark National Park site in Turkey, and there's a lot of speculation that this was actually where Noah's Ark was, where it ended up, because of after the flood, it was so high up there, the water was on this mountaintop here. Have you done research into that location, or do you think that's a hoax?
No, I have done research into that. There is a lot of detailed research on Greater Ararat, and then there's also some research into an area of Iran. The site, the Duniper site, was discovered and promoted by Ron Wyatt. He was a amateur archaeologist, and in the majority of the stuff I've looked at, it's a fascinating site, no question about that. But I do lean towards it being a natural formation as opposed to being the petrified remains of Noah's Ark. There is a ton of information from a variety of different nations, including Russia, with regard to the Ark at one time being in Greater Ararat, at a certain mountain level of Greater Ararat. And there's been lots of expeditions there. In fact, there was one just in 2013 that was a documentary done called Finding Noah to Greater Ararat in search of the Ark. One of the questions I get asked is that if the Ark's up there, why doesn't someone just go find it? That would kind of solve all the questions and the issues. Well, there's been reports in our history that people have seen it. They are on record. Unfortunately, we don't have any video or pictures, but we do have eyewitness accounts back, in a time period before someone would have had a cell phone that took, instant pictures and could post it on Facebook for us. But they are documented things in that, not only from that area, but also from Russia and the United States and other areas of people who have gone and said, yes, we saw this, yes, we saw this. I want to say about 150 years ago, and I'm fuzzy on this particular date because I don't have it in front of me, but there was a large earthquake in that area, and a portion of the mountain Ararat is volcanic, and it blew out one side of the mountain. That side of the mountain is now known as Ahura Gorge. That side of the mountain hosted a monastery which claimed to have pieces of the Ark. And many people had said they had gone there and seen pieces of the Ark. That monastery and the entire side of the mountain was buried under the rubble of that event, and it's now under about 90 feet of ice. It's just impossible to get to. So the question of, well, why doesn't someone go to Ararat and just find this thing? Ararat is, by square footage, the largest mountain in the world, and it is not an easy climb, even for experienced mountain climbers. And aside from that, it's one of the most unstable political areas in the entire world. It's a war zone. So right now you can't even get in there. They're not allowing permits to get in there. But even if you could, it's just not as simple as, hey, let's hike up the mountain and go find the Ark. It's just not that easy.
Now, that's some interesting information too. I had not heard that. The Ark itself, I mean, just the way that they set it up in a pretty quick amount of time. These people, let's talk about Noah and his bloodlines. There's a lot of speculation that they were Nephilim. Some people say they weren't. I mean, what's the story that you've been able to put together with them?
Well, there's something that's going on in the earth about this time, and it's a very unusual event. And this is where, when we look at the Bible passage, in some cases, those that are extremely familiar with the Bible read right through this, and they've had all of the supernatural portions of this passage of Scripture just kind of stripped away to the point where there's nothing here, move along. But there's a very important event that is recorded in the first few verses of Genesis chapter 6. It's recorded very quickly, but it gives us a lot of information that is reinforced later on by a couple of New Testament writers and also reinforced in a couple of other ancient books. That event is a event where you had heavenly angelic type beings that most people would know as watchers cohabitating with earthly women and producing a hybrid race. Now, this is kind of blown right past in the first few verses of Genesis chapter 6, but there is a great deal of information and detail that's given to us in the book of Enoch by presumably the writer of Enoch, who gives us the detail of who these watcher beings were, what they did, why it was so detrimental, and what was the end result. The book of Jubilees tells us when they appeared on the scene. It says they appeared on the scene during the days of someone named Jared. Jared was about 5 generations removed from Adam, in the same bloodline as Adam's son Seth. You have him being born during his days. These watcher beings, angelic type beings, began to be prevalent in the earth and began to interact with mankind. A couple of generations later, you have his son Enoch and then Enoch's son Methuselah. When Enoch is born, things seem to be rocking along pretty smoothly. Enoch is named, his name means one who is teaching or one who is instructing. And a lot of the names that you see as they're presented in the Bible may or may not be the person's given name. They may be the person's legendary name. In other words, it may be a name similar to what we would call a nickname that they were kind of tagged with after the fact for the purposes of telling a story. With the case of Enoch and his father Jared, Jared's name means they descended. Enoch's name means given to instruction. Enoch's son is known as Methuselah. His name means men of shooting weapons. It seems like that sometime between Enoch's early years and the birth of Methuselah, some things have really changed and gone sideways. At that point, you can see the storyline really began to pick up, where these watcher-type beings have interacted with human women and produced a hybrid race. That hybrid race has several factors in their favor, not the least of which being that they apparently, as they are described not only in the book of Genesis but also in other ancient manuscripts, they are physically imposing and superior to the human race that exists at that time. The other thing is that they can point to their patronage, their fathers, the watchers, and say, we are from a superior being. We are from an angelic being. We are from a being that predates human beings, if we trace human beings back to Adam. So they had a claim and they had physical superiority. This created quite an issue as far as a conquest of mankind's survival on the earth and these new hybrid beings on the earth. And this issue played out over a course of about 500 years. Now, I want to step back for just a second into the early portions of the book of Genesis. Genesis chapter 1, verse 26 is, we're familiar with the passage where God says, let us create man in our own image. And then the very next verse, it says, so God, the Creator, created man in his own image, but then it tells exactly why man was fashioned. God gave him dominion over all of creation. Man had a job to do. In the next chapter, Genesis chapter 2, we're told that God put man in a garden paradise. And in that garden paradise, everything was exactly as God had created it to be. And he instructed Adam to bring the world into this particular type of order and this particular type of care. Adam was to be the person who was to care for the earth, the rest of creation. Well, now as you move forward into a time period where you have these hybrid beings, they are trying to wrestle that dominion away from the very ones it was gifted to, which is the line of Adam. And so therein you have the conflict between the two. And we took about a chapter and a half in the book, a portion of chapter 2 and most of chapter 3, to try to really dig into the backline of that story in great detail. As we got into chapter 4, we dealt more with Noah himself and why he was special. But this conflict went on for about 500 years, to the point where the Creator, God himself, finally intervened and said, hey, this has gotten so violent. There is so much bloodshed in the earth. We have to bring this to an end. And there was a war between these hybrid beings to the point where they began to destroy each other. This is recorded for us in the book of Enoch. And I tried to very carefully weave that into the story, as this is the resource and this is why Enoch's information can be something that we can rely on. Pinned against that are two passages in the New Testament. One is penned by the author of the book of Jude, and one is penned by Peter. Both of those reference this particular event and the judgment of God that followed this event. They reference the angels that stayed not in their first estate, as it's referred to by Jude. In other words, they didn't maintain the order and the activity that they were supposed to maintain and stay within. They went outside of that. They got aggressive. They got very selfish in what they wanted to do. They had a mission that was assigned to them. They laid that aside. They rebelled against that mission, and they went about doing their own thing, which was, hey, we want to take over creation. And that is outlined for us in just a couple of short verses in Jude. But Jude goes on to say they were judged for that. Peter says the exact same thing in his book. I believe it's in 2 Peter. He says the exact same thing. So this hybrid race that was a result of this intermingling of angels and human women is dealt with in a very judgmental fashion by the Creator himself. The offspring off of that hybrid race, though, and we deal with this in the latter portions of chapter 3, the offspring of that hybrid race, the second, the third, the fourth generation down, they were not dealt with supernaturally. They were still in the earth. But the Creator himself looked upon man and said, now the odds are kind of even. Now you have these that want to say, hey, we're superior beings, and you have humans that can say, hey, wait a minute, our Creator is the only superior being and we serve him. So now there's a conflict, not so much of physical battle, but of belief between two groups or two bloodlines. The one bloodline who trusts Yahweh, their creator, and says he is the one we serve, and the other bloodline that says, no, we are direct descendants of the angels, you will serve us. And therein draws a great conflict that plays out over the next 700 or so years prior to the flood.
Okay. Well, that's a really interesting perspective there. I appreciate that. And I've heard before that many people believe that's why the flood took place, and that's why, in the Bible, God tells his people to kill all the men, women, and children of certain areas because it was all intertwined DNA and it wasn't pure. I have heard that theory many times. So, and that could very well be. One of the things that I find fascinating also is right now there is a lot of speculation, Mark, that the return of Planet X is going to be imminent, and the wormwood that's talked about in Revelation, some people think that that's Planet X. I'm under the impression that that's either Chernobyl event that took place, because that is the word of wormwood in Ukrainian, but also it could be an asteroid. I've heard that too. Do you believe in Planet X? And if you do you think that maybe the cycle of this star or of this planet was what caused the Great Flood when, back in Noah's day?
I have to say that going into my writing and my research, Planet X wasn't on the radar at all. And I would have fallen into the category of folks who, really disregarded it as something that was less than realistic, something that was maybe more sci-fi in nature. I had read the books of Zecharia Sitchin. I think many people are familiar with his work. I had read a lot of his books. I'm very familiar with it. But Planet X wasn't on my horizon whatsoever. But as I began to look at events down through history, and I began to see the nature and the extent of things that were happening, I began to see a cycle kind of develop. And that's when I began to open and research the nature of Planet X more from the scientific side than anything else. That's where I began to do a lot of more research into astronomy and things of that nature. And I really feel like that there's enough information out there to leave even the skeptical person scratching their head and saying, well, I can't really explain how this happened. And those who wanted to be on the Planet X bandwagon, well, there's plenty of fodder for them. That is actual scientific information. Unfortunately, a lot of that never gets out over the internet, but there's plenty of stuff there. And we included a lot of that in the book as we basically took a look at each one of the planets in our solar system and some of the uniqueness of each one of the planets of our solar system. Things such as the planet Mercury, which has a very elongated orbit. It's a smaller planet, smaller mass planet. It's the closest planet to the sun, and you would think over a period of years that its orbit around the sun would be pretty much an even, well-regulated circular orbit. It's not. It's very elongated, and that is something that's just abnormal. There has to be a reason for that. You get to the planet of Venus, and even science tells us that Venus has had a very catastrophic event in its recent past that almost resurfaced the entire planet volcanically. The interesting thing about Venus is upside down and rotates backwards. It's the only planet in the solar system that does. It also takes a much longer period of time to go through one cycle. What we would know here on Earth as a 24-hour day is a much longer period of time on Venus. It rotates much slower, it almost to the point of not having that much rotation at all. And its journey around the sun is a little bit in a different cycle with us. That's why sometimes it appears extremely bright in our sky, and other times it appears kind of distant. That all has to do with its resonance with our orbit, and we looked at those things. Then we went past Earth and to Mars, and looked at Mars. Mars is a planet that has almost no atmosphere whatsoever. It has a canyon on it that is more than 5 times the size of the Grand Canyon that we have in Arizona.
Wouldn't that be cool if we could go out there and see that, like Arnold Schwarzenegger in Total Recall?
and just do an exploration around Mars, right? Supposedly we've got a rover there, and I say supposedly just so people can properly align themselves on each side of that argument. But supposedly we've got a rover there that's sending pictures back to us. But
some very interesting ones too.
The Great Grand Canyon of Mars, there was a time period where people thought, well, yeah, that was carved out with water, and it was a very catastrophic event that carved this thing out in just a short period of time. There's also a lot of information that says that wasn't carved out with water. That's an electrical strike, and that electrical strike was a catastrophic electrical strike that not only carved out that canyon, but also put one of Mars's moons in orbit, because there's one of Mars's moons that is fairly close to the planet, to the point where it's cycling closer and closer and closer to Mars. And many people believe that it, at some point in the future, will eventually crash back into Mars itself. But that particular moon is an elongated rock. It's not a coalesced group in a rounded shape like most moons would be.
Are you talking about Phobos?
Yeah, it's a very odd shape.
A lot of people think that moon isn't even a natural body. As a matter of fact, if you go back even to the 60s, the administration then, their science advisor said that he thought that was a spaceship. And then Buzz Aldrin even came out recently and said, because there's this weird anomaly that pokes out that you can see on photographs. It's just, you'll see this very smooth surface, and then all of a sudden there's this, looks like an obelisk, actually, this just humongous obelisk that pops out. That's a very interesting anomaly out there indeed.
Oh, it absolutely is. And what's even more interesting, and this is something that this is a nugget that I'll throw out there and let some of your listeners research a little bit. But in Gulliver's Travels, you will find the mention of the 2 moons of Mars. Gulliver's Travels was written before we discovered that Mars had moons. And it's very interesting. There's a lot of, if you just Google moons of Mars and Gulliver's Travels, you'll find some very interesting reading in that area. But as we move past Mars and to the other planets, we see some very interesting things as well. Jupiter has some weird things going on with it, in that it has its own beds of asteroids that follow it around in its orbit. It is the one planet that sits most upright on its axis. Saturn's tilted a little bit. It has some weird things going on. There's many who believe the planets Neptune and Uranus used to be a part of the inner solar system, and at some point in time were driven out or cast out into the outer solar system and actually switched places when they did. The really strange thing is that Uranus rotates on its side. It's, whereas we sit at a slight angle in our axial rotation with the sun, which gives us seasons, Uranus basically lays on its side with its north pole pointed towards the sun and kind of rolls around as if it's a ball on a flat surface. It's really strange. So there's a lot of different things in the solar system that you look at and go, okay, something had to have caused this. There's a lot of scientific astronomy information that points to the very things that scientists are starting to reveal to us now, and that is there are other planets way out there that we didn't know anything about, and they cause an effect on our planets. The only question that's still up in the air for people is, do any of those planets actually interact with the inner solar system, and would one of them, we can use the term Planet X, have caused some of the abnormalities in our solar system that we can't explain any other way? And I think that's something that a lot of people kind of lean towards, but they just don't want to dig in and present that as factual evidence. But it sure is compelling evidence.
It's interesting that you bring up that the canyon in Mars, because we had Cliff High on here with the Webbots the other day, and he was talking about the Grand Canyon here on Earth, and his theory about how it was created was a 40-year time span of basically electromagnetic plasma type discharge, and kind of what you were referring to with the giant canyon on Mars. So that's interesting. That's a pretty fascinating possibility. And if it is on this specific orbit and a 3,600-year cycle, or however long the cycle is, I know that there was a couple people that came out recently from Caltech University. We tried to get them on the show here at the Leak Project, and they didn't get back to us, unfortunately, but they said that they discovered a planetary body in our solar system, actually. And there's been some weird things going on with the moon. You've got some people that say there's absolutely no way Planet X could be anywhere close to us right now, because if it was, every volcano would be going off on the planet. And I'm as agnostic as I can be on the subject, but certainly would like to know your opinion on it, and I appreciate you bringing that to our attention. Now, also, if you look at the amount of water that it took to actually cause this event back when Noah's flood happened, I mean, how much water would that take? Did all the ice caps and all the glaciers melt? And there's got to be some interesting science to that.
Well, and that's kind of another one of the things that kind of look at you from down the dark hallway in the corner and say, you'll never figure me out. And it's interesting that you bring up water, because with relation to Planet X, and I think there's even something circulating on the internet right now about next week or a week after, Saturn is going to be doing a drive-by or something and be 100 times the size of the moon or something like that. It's interesting what people will see on the internet and just put it out there as factual evidence, and we lose all sense of reasonability. Here's the one thing that I would anticipate being, and there's a lot of research now that supports what people would refer to as an electric universe. There's people that will tell us that there's even as far away as the moon is, there's an electrical connection with the Earth, even at that distance between our magnetic field, etc., that keeps us connected. One of the things that I would anticipate if Planet X was getting anywhere near us, one of the first things that I would anticipate noticing and physically being unable to deny would be our tides. The moon has a great effect on our tides, and we know that. We are accustomed to that. We don't even question that. When the moon is a little bit closer, we have higher and lower tides because there's a stronger pull. When it's further away, our tides aren't nearly as drastic. If you took a heavenly body such as a Planet X and moved it into a proximity where it was close enough that it could have an effect on our earthquakes and volcanoes, I think the number one thing that we would see would be a undeniable effect on our tides. And so that's one of the things that, I'll just throw that out as something that, in the realm of reasonability, I would expect that. Now let's get back to the water and the ark, and how do you flood the earth? And that was really something that I felt was something that was kind of dragging. It was kind of down the hallway staring at me and going, you're not going to resolve this idea. You're not going to be able to, to deal with this whatsoever. And as we look at the water, there's really something that becomes very interesting. And I did a lot of research into geology and some of the aspects of geology from major geologists who had written on these types and topics. One of the geologists that has had the greatest impact on how that field of study is reviewed, researched, and understood is a gentleman named Alfred Wegener, and he was one of the first people, or the first person, to kind of float the idea of Pangea and continental drift. He noticed that on the European and the American sides of the two continents that there were certain areas of crossover where the terrain seemed to be an identical match. And so he floated this idea that at one point in time, these two continents were together and they drifted apart. Well, you wouldn't think it because that's kind of broadly accepted now, but when he first floated that idea, he was absolutely lambasted for it. and really ridiculed to the point of almost being blackballed as a critical source for information. But as more people studied his work, more people agreed with his work. And now, today, we kind of, casually accept the idea without too much criticism at all that at one point in time, continents were pushed together and they drifted apart. Well, I also found on the heels of his work, two other geologists that did their work independent of each other. Neither one of them knew they were studying this, but they both came up with the same identical final results and opinion. One was named Samuel Warren Carey, and the other one was named Ott Christoph Helgenberg. He was a German. Both of them published books about the concept of the expanding Earth. That is, not only was the Earth continents together at one point in time, but the entire Earth itself was a smaller planet at one given time. And when the continents began to separate, the Earth began to grow in size. This is a really interesting concept to look into. Some people have just casually dismissed it, but as you begin to look into it, you'll find that both of these guys are highly respected, highly regarded geologists, and that their research is pretty impressive. Now, I'll point you towards a video on the internet that's gotten a lot of looks that kind of boils this down as something simplistic and visual. And as I said in the opening, I'm very visual, so I need visual. There's a gentleman who's best known for doing the artistic work on Batman. His name is Neil Adams, and he has a video on YouTube called The Growing Earth. Now, I don't agree with every aspect of this particular video, but I think it is a great presentation of what these two geologists were trying to convey in their massive works. I have the book by Samuel Warren Carey. It's a little over 500 pages in length. I've read good portions of it. Some of it's a little over my head, but it's really an interesting read. The other one I don't have, it's in German. But the concept is something that's very interesting. Was the Earth at one time a smaller planet with primarily a land mass and smaller bodies of water and flowing rivers? That's kind of how it's presented in the early portions of Genesis. And so that's why I put that in the book and spent about 20 pages dealing with it. Now, after I got past that, I wanted to deal with the water, because the water itself, I really wanted to remove anything that someone would say, well, yeah, that's just a crutch to get you over this hump. One of the biggest things that you'll hear from those who promote and teach and present on creationism when it comes to the flood is that before the flood, the mountains weren't nearly as large as they are now. And maybe it was, maybe it wasn't. I don't know. I wasn't there. I'm only 50-something years old, so I've got to go on what I can dig up. What I can dig up is simple math that I learned in 10th grade geometry, and I'm still smart enough to work my way through the formula. That is that the Earth is a spheroid, and there's a geometric formula that tells you how to find a volume of a sphere. Basically, if you had a water balloon, it's telling you how to find out, based on the size of the water balloon, how much water is in the balloon. Okay? If you take that particular formula and you plug in the Earth's radius, it works off of radius, not diameter. You plug in the Earth's radius at sea level, it tells you the volume of the Earth at sea level. If you are going to flood the Earth above the highest mountain, you then need to find a second volume level. You need to expand above sea level to above the highest mountain peak. Now, we mentioned 3 different mountains in the book. One of them is the tallest mountain in the world. It's actually off the coast of Hawaii, but a good portion of it is submerged, so we dismissed that one. The other one is a mountain that is really at the equator, so it stretches the greatest distance into the stratosphere, but it's not as tall as the mountain that everyone is familiar with, which is Everest. And since I was mainly interested in just raw feet, I took the measurements of Everest. And when I took the measurements of Everest, I wanted my math to be simple, so I rounded up. And as I presented this formula in the book, the math that we used went 500 feet above the top of Mount Everest as it stands today. So if we were going to flood the Earth 500 feet above the top of Mount Everest, how much water would we need? That's where our second level of the sphere needed to be. As I did this math and worked it out, what I found was that we needed a little over 3 1/3 times the amount of water that we have on the surface today. 3 1/3 times. Now, many people think that if you melted the ice caps, you would flood the Earth. You might ruin some waterfront property in Florida, but the folks around the edges of Mount Everest are not even going to notice the difference. The ice caps, as large as they are, the Arctic and the Antarctic, as massive as those two areas are, make up less than 2% of the water that's on the surface of the Earth today. Most of the water on the surface of the Earth today is in the oceans. So I thought just taking the ice caps and thawing them out doesn't even scratch the surface of what we needed. So we went back into more geological research, and I found 3 recent studies. I've found one since I published the book. I think I noted 2 in the book with footnotes that geological surveys, recent modern-day geological surveys, there is more than 5 times the amount of water in the crust of the Earth than we have on the surface. So if you wanted to flood the Earth with water, the only thing you need to do is bring some of the water that's in the crust of the Earth to the surface. Well, that's the very thing that Genesis tells us that happened. The fountains of the deep broke open. There's many, many passages in the Bible that tells us that the crust of the Earth, the foundations of the Earth, the land masses of the Earth were stretched out above the waters. Everything in the creation account indicates that there was more water under the Earth than there was on the surface. But the bottom line is, if we took the Earth as it is right now today, without shrinking it to a smaller size, without putting any of the water that's in the oceans back under the crust of the Earth, if we take it exactly as it is today, there is still enough water in the crust of the Earth to flood this planet more than 500 feet above the top of Mount Everest. And that's science.
Okay. I've heard that theory before also about there being oceans underneath our oceans that are bigger than the ones we have access to currently. And that was with Dr. Brooks Agnew, actually. He was going to do a tour and get to the center of the Earth, or attempt to, but because of cost and time restraints, the location that he was actually going to go was in the Antarctic somewhere, because there was an ice sheet that broke off and gave them better access to the specific opening. They never made it, unfortunately. So hopefully somebody out there will find out what really is in the center of the Earth. But that's a pretty cool amount of information, I'd say. I had not thought of that possibility before, and that certainly brings up more of a reference point for those to look into.
Well, if you've got his name and address and he still wants to do that, I've got a couple of books from people who wrote about the hollow Earth, and they tell you exactly where the hole is so you can find your way in to get to the inner Earth.
I'd like to speak to them as well. That'd be, get them on the show, and maybe we can get enough people that put together. We can do that opportunity. That'd be great.
I've got 2 books, and maybe I'll see if I can't get some excerpts from them to send your way. They're fascinating reading. They absolutely are. One includes the Diary of Admiral Byrd, which is a great read. And another one is from Scandinavia Nordic, which I actually bought for my wife since that's her heritage, and she enjoys reading things about the Scandinavians and the Vikings, and this is a gentleman who tells his tale. And it's really an interesting read. I believe the name of the book is The Smoky God, but it's really an interesting read. But there's a lot of people that believe the earth is hollow.
Yeah.
That some people just swat that out of the way as, crackpot conspiracy theory, but there's a lot of people who believe the earth is hollow.
It's a very old theory indeed, and it's been around for thousands of years. And certainly the Vikings and their heritage is incredible. Sign me up for Valhalla.
There you go.
Those guys were great, man. I certainly, the series that's out now is pretty intense. I don't know if you guys have kept up on that. There's a lot of blood and guts and gore and drama, but it's fun to watch some of the characters.
People sometimes cast me into this, and I'm glad these things do come out in conversation sometime, because it makes me a little bit less cardboard and a little bit more flesh and blood. But yeah, my wife she records every episode of the Vikings, and she watches it. I'm going to throw out the word religiously. Hopefully no one just cringed, but she watches it religiously. I watch it from time to time with her as well, because I enjoy all of that kind of stuff.
Yeah, it's pretty intense. I think that the character Ragnoff Lothbrok, I mean, I don't know the guy's name that plays that character, but incredible acting, because you can see him go through these different stages when he's at the peak of leadership, getting to that point, and then when he kind of doesn't really care anymore about being the king and he just wants to kick back and relax, and just he does a good job playing those different levels, and then his kids grow up and stuff. It's pretty neat to watch that. But as far as the let's get into some different mythos if we could here, because I was reading in the book that you've put together. In the beginning, you've got a point that references some of the Greek mythos, where you've got Kronos and Zeus. And I just want to read this real quick from the book. Kronos ate his own children as they were born. This had happened 5 times prior to Zeus' mother, Rhea, making the decision to hide the newborn Zeus in a cave of Mount Ida in Crete. So, that's interesting. And where do you get into the different mythos and such as far as in connection with the Great Flood?
Well, and that's something that I felt like when you talk to those who are of Greek heritage, if you visited Greece, if you looked at their history, if you looked at their culture, we think of the Clash of the Titans and the works of Homer and those types of things. We think of them as fiction. To the Greeks, they're not fiction; they're history. They're real history. And so when you get that perspective, you kind of scratch your head and go, well, why would they consider this history? And you start digging a little bit deeper into it. And I think I gave the illustration in the book of, 1,000 years from now, no one is going to be looking for the bones of Luke and Leia. I mean, we're pretty, certain at this stage that George Lucas dreamed those up, and those are fictitious characters. But in the first century, there was, people worshipped Zeus in the day that Christ walked around, and during his ministry, the Greeks worshipped Zeus. He was their god. So these characters were not fictitious by any means in that culture. Well, as you go back and you look at Genesis chapter 6, there's a verse that says that there were giants in those days and also after that. And there's a lot of people who take that and they go, okay, so you've got giants in the earth in the days of Noah, and then after that, on the other side of the flood, you've got giants in the earth again. And there's some truth to that, and there's some things there that really need to be sorted out with that. First of all, days of Noah, the giants that were the hybrid beings that were born to this union of angels and women, they only lasted about 500 years. Their offspring were the ones that were causing problems in the days of Noah. The also after that portion of that verse, there's punctuation in there, not only in the English, but also in the Hebrew. It says also after that, the same became men of renown. Well, who is the same? The same, if you look at it grammatically, and I think that the writers and the translators both tried to influence the thoughts of their readers by using proper grammar. If you look at it grammatically, When you read the phrase, the same became, the words the same points back to the in those days. The giants in those days. Well, the giants in those days became men of renown later on. I really believe that this is where our stories of the Titans came from. And that's why I included the story of Kronos. A lot of people will think of Kronos as, oh, yeah, that's Father Time. Different Kronos. Kronos had children, and the prophecy was that his children would unseat him from the throne. Well, he didn't want that to happen, so the legend of Kronos has it that he would eat his children. Well, the story of Zeus is that his mother hid him as opposed to bringing him to Kronos. Instead, she brought a large stone wrapped in a blanket and gave it to Kronos. That Kronos supposedly ate the stone. Later on, Zeus and his wife poisons him. He throws up the stone and also all of Zeus's brothers and sisters. This is the ancient story of the Greeks, but I included it in the book for the simple reason and the tie back to the legendary giants of those days later became men of renown. There was a basis to Homer's writings. It wasn't fictitious. It was pointing back. And if you read a lot of the Greek historians, you will see that they tie a lot of those things together for you, so you can't miss the connections.
And so you've got those put together, and do you have other reference points from different parts of the world with some of the ancient cultures as well?
As far as
connecting to the flood.
There's a couple of interesting things when you get on the other side of the flood in the Middle East, and this is something that I think could be the sleeping dog that we walked past about 40 minutes ago.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And I don't want to disturb. If we can nudge him just a little bit now and kick up some dust,
offer him a biscuit.
Yeah, let's see what we can do here. Because as we get on the other side of the flood, you'll remember I said that there was this conflict between humankind who knew who their creator was, Yahweh, and they were encouraged and taught to serve and honor their creator, Yahweh, but they had these other beings who were saying, hey, no, we're from the angels, you will bow down and serve us. Well, there was a point in time where that side was winning the war, even to the point where all of creation had become corrupted. And yes, there was physical corruption, but I think there was also on a large scale, a spiritual corruption as well. Because as you read about Noah, one of the first things that you read about him is that he was perfect and upright in his ways. That meant that he was still serving Yahweh, the Creator. In fact, in all of the Old Testament, we read about many patriarchs in the Old Testament, prophets and priests and kings, and just some magnificent stories. We read about people who saw the throne room of God. Isaiah writes about that. We read about Daniel, who stood in a den of lions and supposedly shut their mouths. We read about Joseph, who stood before an Egyptian king and said, hey, this is the dream that you saw. Daniel did the same thing with Nebuchadnezzar. He said, I don't know what the dream is, but if you'll let me go catch a nap, I'll be back and I'll tell you this dream. And then he came back and he said, this is the dream you saw, and here's the interpretation of the dream. And then Daniel also prayed and said, I don't understand what's going on, and an angel came to him and unveiled other things. These had to be really special people. I mean, really incredible people to have these types of experiences if what we're reading about their lives is accurate. But when you go to Noah, you read very little about him, but one of the phrases that you see about him is, and Noah walked with God. That is a phrase you don't see of anyone else other than Enoch, which tells me that Noah himself was incredibly special as well. You have this conflict going on, and the side that is saying, bow down and worship us, you will subject yourself to us, we're from the angels, they are winning. Noah says, hey, I'm not bowing down. I am not. I'm serving Yahweh. Yahweh is my God. Well, when you get over on the other side of the flood, and this is where I think maybe it bears out to one of the things you brought up early on about the mass killings as the children of Israel had left Egypt and they're entering into the promised land, and we don't understand what's going on there. And we have this concept that Joshua and his army just went in and they killed everybody. And that's not entirely accurate. There were certain clans that were annihilated, and they were annihilated for a very specific reason, which is borne out in the text. And I don't want to get into the details of that, but the detail that I do want to get into is found in the book of Joshua, chapter 5, and it's just before Joshua and his army are about to set into battle against Jericho. And if I could just read a small portion here, it says in the end of chapter 5, I'm picking up with verse 13, it came to pass when Joshua was by Jericho that he lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, there stood a man over against him with his sword drawn in his hand. And Joshua went unto him and said unto him, art thou for us or for our adversaries? And the man answered and said, nay, but as the captain of the host of the Lord am I now come. And Joshua fell on his face to the earth, and he did worship him, and said to him, what saith my Lord to his servant? Now, the people of this particular time knew that you only worshiped Yahweh. You did not worship anyone other than Yahweh. So when Joshua does this, it is extremely significant. In the end of the chapter, the captain of the Lord's host says to Joshua, take off your shoes from your foot because you're on holy ground. That's the same words that were said to Moses before he led the people out of Egypt at the burning bush. He was said, take off your shoes from off your feet. You're on holy ground. This is a very special individual that Joshua is face to face with, and he recognizes that, and he bows down and he worships. This is the presence of Yahweh that he's standing in. This is the guy, this is the one who is going to lead the army in the battle against Jericho. Jericho was one of those cities where the descendants of the Nephilim were said to exist. And this was a battle that many of the Israelites, when they looked at that conflict and they said, hey, these guys are giants and we're grasshoppers compared to them. Plus, we are slaves that just came out of Egypt not too long ago, crossed the desert. We're just now learning how to use this thing you call a sword and a shield. These guys are military trained giants. We don't have a chance against them. No way. Let's stay in the desert. 40 years later, their kids are going in under the leadership of Joshua, and Joshua is leading that army, and he finds out, hey, you're not fighting alone. I'm leading this fight. He walks into the presence of Yahweh. This is the same thing that Noah would have had on the other side of the flood because he walked with God. It's the same thing that Noah presented to the children of men. Turn back to the Creator and serve Him, serve Yahweh, and they would not listen. They would have nothing to do with that. We see that exact same thing played out on both sides of the flood. So when we read that verse, men of renown, giants after the flood, yeah, we have them. And when they go into Canaan, they have someone that is going to do battle on their behalf against a very specific foe and enemy that they don't have a shot of beating on their own.
And it's interesting as well because also in the reference of, those certain attacks that take place and those military combats that are written about in the Bible in the Old Testament, I've found some interesting things as well when they reference kill the livestock as well. Mm-hmm. And I think, okay, well, I guess strategically, if you kill the livestock, then anybody that's left over won't have an opportunity to get food as easily, and maybe that's why. Or maybe did they manipulate the DNA too and create these GMO cows?
I think you're on to something with your second option. Remember, one of the things that we read on the prior to the flood was that all of creation had been corrupted. The thing that we didn't really get into in detail that's presented in the book of Enoch was that it was a very violent and a very bloody world. When you get into this conquest of Canaan, you've got that same bloodline, and that same bloodline is a corrupted bloodline, and the animals were being sacrificed to their gods. So they were corrupted animals. And in that era and time, if you were a female who was married, okay, you would have been also a part of that union. If you were a female that was a virgin that had not yet been married, you would not have been. So that's where you see the connection of take care of them, take care of their wives, and take care of all their livestock, and burn everything with fire. Don't even take any of this stuff because it's corrupted. It is absolutely, number one, of no use to you. You don't need it. But number two, it is abhorrent and appalling to Yahweh himself. It is corrupted in that aspect. And so it could not, the Israelites could not take it and say, okay, well, we'll take some of this because we need these supplies. It would be the same thing as if you and your family went out to dinner and you had the meal come to the table and your server said, you know what, I brought your meal to you, but I just want to give you an inside scoop. For the last 3 days, everyone who's been eating the chicken wings has been getting violently sick the next day. Now, we've been looking into this. We really haven't found, we don't think there's anything to it, but everybody who's been eating the chicken wings has been getting violently sick. And since you ordered chicken wings, I'm going to bring them to the table for you, but I really wouldn't eat them. Who's going to touch the chicken wings? We've been told, hey, touch that. We are going to get violently sick. We're going to get ill. We best leave that alone. Well, that's a very crude illustration, but that's kind of the same thing going on here. All of the possessions, all of the livestock, everything that was owned by these corrupted clans, these Nephilim, were abhorrent to God. They were the thing that they weren't to touch. Why? Because it would cause problems for them later on if they did. So that's kind of where that whole conquest was going.
Mm-hmm. And I've definitely heard that before, and let's say that is the story, and God told his people to do that because of the DNA manipulation, etc. What do you think? God is all-knowing?
If he's God.
Okay.
I mean, if he's not all-knowing, he's not God. I don't know if I just painted my shoulders into a corner there, but I would say that if he's God.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, and most people would say that, right? Most people would say God is all-knowing, and then I say, okay, so God is all-knowing. I can appreciate that. Well, and this is where I just have a hard time with it, and I don't know. I've brought this up before, and I've heard many explanations, and like you just gave me your explanation, I really appreciate that. And I typically don't get too deep into this, but this is one thing that I've just often wondered. If God is all-knowing, why would he create something knowing that it's going to fail? And they'll say, well, because God gives you free will. Well, if it's free will, but in the spectrum of free will, there's failure, which ends up creating such catastrophes and horrific life events for everybody involved. I mean, I would just think that wouldn't it be much easier not to create that in the first place, or have a much more efficient way to take those out? Because if God is forgiving to everybody, he should forgive even his enemies, right? Because he tells us to forgive our enemies. It's just a whole mind meld, and I just have a tough time understanding all these concepts. But I can certainly appreciate everybody's beliefs behind it. And once again, I was raised Christian, and I can certainly appreciate that. Wonderful people, like you, Paul Beagley, Michael Heiser, many others that listen to the show have very good, strong Christian faith and values, and I applaud you for that. Faith is very valuable, so keep doing what you're doing. Things for me, I guess it's going to take a while to put the pieces together and fully understand it, but that's why I like having the opportunity to speak to people like you, Mark.
Well, let me ask you this, as if you brought up a question that's really something that people discuss, rediscuss, and bounce back and forth. in a lot of very interesting ways and ideas. If God is all-knowing, the basic question is, why did he, quote unquote, create evil, or why does he allow evil in the world? And I think you kind of brought up the one dangling thread, which is the thread of free will. And if you take someone who is a loving father or a loving mother, and they love their child dearly, they're going to do everything that they can to protect that child. But they are also going to allow that child certain freedoms so that that child can grow and develop and learn. And again, this is a very crude analogy and illustration, but for the overprotective parent who doesn't allow that child to experience life but shelters them from everything, they stunt that child's growth to the point where now some folks would look at the parent and say, hey, they're just absolutely cruel. They're not, they say they love their child, but they love their child to the point of denying their child the freedom to experience and learn about life. Well, they're doing that with a very, very good reason, because they know, they've learned that if they touch the stove, it's going to burn them, and it's going to take a while to recover from that burn. So I want to keep my child from doing that. But you take a parent who loves their child and gives their child, at the appropriate time, freedom of choice and freedom of will. Every now and then that child does touch that stove and does learn that lesson for themselves. And in the relationship that they now have with their parent, they can now go back to that parent and say, yeah, I did that very thing you told me not to do, and you know what? You were right. It wasn't a good idea. And the relationship is still there. But for the child who has the overbearing parent who shelters them in, and that child finally breaks free and touches that and learns that lesson, now there's not the same relationship that they can go back to that parent, because now they're like, oh, my parent is never going to, accept me back on this level, because this is the very thing that they told me, don't ever do, don't ever do, don't ever do. And now that I've done it, I must be an outcast. So there's a break in that relationship. And again, very crude analogy, but it's kind of the best illustration that I could probably paint in that circumstance.
Well, I appreciate that, Mark. And, it's just fascinating, the possibilities and the spiritual battles everybody faces, and this cycle that we live in. It just seems as if, you've got the life-death cycle, the yin, the yang, the opposite of everything. It's the life of dualities. If you look at, I guess, the vibrational frequency that everything breaks down to, if you look at it at the quantum level, the opposite of things create the possibility to understand what you and I would look at as good and bad. I think that our conscience is our guide. At least it is for me. If you go out and do something and it's wrong because yourself is telling you that quiet voice, well, then But then there's people out there that have no conscience, and they do things without even realizing, full-on sociopaths sometimes, and you wonder, okay, well, how can I judge them if they can't even judge themselves?
Right, yeah.
So it's certainly interesting. But yeah, let's jump back over into your book in the beginning, because I'm looking in here as well when you start talking about some of the, reference points to what it's like now versus what it was like pre-flood times. Do you think that the events that are taking place and the society that is around today is actually at a point where it was back then, and that's why the flood happened?
Well, I think we've got a number of things going on in that aspect. One of the things that is a verse that stands out in Genesis that is difficult for us to kind of to parse and to understand is a passage that says, and it repented God that he had made man. And, that we read that and we go, okay, in our language, that means God was sorry that he made man in the first place. I think some of the aspects there are that the Creator God gives us freedom to be who we want to be. But he says in that freedom that I am here for you, and I want to provide for you the things that you need, the things that are best for you. So when you reach a point where there's a separation to the aspect of the creator God now no longer has that relationship with the very creation that he brought into existence, you can kind of understand if we can put emotions on God, the sadness and the regret that may be there. The very thing that he wants to have a relationship with now has separated on its own free will from separated that relationship and caused a break in that relationship. So I think some of those things play out prior to the flood, which eventually brings this flood judgment, because some of the problems did have to be cleaned up. But there was an aspect in that the judgment would be either repealed or delayed if mankind would return to acknowledging and worshiping their creator, Yahweh. Well, when you get to the other side of the flood, Jesus in his earthly ministry several times mentioned, as people would ask him, hey, what shall be the end of time? What shall be the end of things? Where is this all going? There were a couple of times that Jesus would say, as it was in the days of Noah. Now that leaves a big open window for a lot of things to be plugged in there, some very accurately and some very haphazardly. But one of the things that I think we have to examine and consider as a part of that package is, what was the relationship with the Creator in the days of Noah? And the relationship with the Creator in the days of Noah was one of separation. In the book of Jasher, it's separated to the point where we have a small passage that talks about how Noah went to other people that he knew. Certainly he had a relationship with other people that he lived in and around. It says that he went to the children of men and said, return to worshiping the Creator, return to Yahweh, worship him, acknowledge him. He is the one who has created this. And they would not return. They would not listen. In fact, they told him, there is no Creator, there is no Yahweh, there is only what we have here, what we can see, touch, feel, hear, and experience. As the floodwaters began to fall, the book of Jasher says that there are a group of people who are crying out to Noah, saying, open the ark that we might come in. This somewhere gets mixed into that Sunday school story that I heard when I was a little kid. It's not in the Bible. I don't know if my Sunday school teacher who had the flannel graph actually read the book of Jasher or not, but it's not in the Bible. But it is in the book of Jasher. And the book of Jasher, the ancient Jewish history book, says that these people were crying out, saying, Noah, open the ark that we might come in. And Noah's response is very simply, you have said in your own heart that there is no Creator, there is no God, and the separation is final. And so do we see that playing out in our world today? I think sadly in a lot of circles we absolutely do. It's one of the reasons why I really appreciate the work of someone like a Mike Heiser so very much, because he steps back into the perspective and the mindset and the point of view of the ancient Israelite and walks you through many of the Old Testament passages from that perspective, and it makes it come to life. So many of those things that we read right past in our modern day educated world. And one of the things that we have been taught, that we have accepted, that we believe, that we cling to in our modern day educated world is that there is no Creator, there is no God, and all that we have is that which we can see, touch, and feel, and hear, and experience from day to day. And when this life is over, we die and there's nothing. And in those aspects, I think the days of Noah and the days that we live in today have a lot of similarities.
You do bring up some very thought-provoking ideas, and I can certainly see, as far as a culture, many people, whatever their faith is, they tend to be steering away from that more and kind of It's more about themselves. So you've really brought up some good points, and I applaud the way you bring it together all so eloquently. I'd like to recommend our listeners check out Mark's website at markcombsauthor.com. Also, your new book that you came out with, if you'd like to know more about Noah's Ark and the possibilities behind it. I mean, just incredible stuff. There's a lot of detailed illustrations in here that I can't show you on this podcast, so check it out. In the beginning, Mark Combs. This has been great, Mark. I really appreciate you joining us here at the Leak Project. For those that would like to get access to the podcasts first and free, make sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel, youtube.com/clandestine Time Lord. And before we go, Mark, is there anything else that you'd like to share with us or information for our audience so they can get more on what you're doing?
Yeah, I would like to add one more thing out there. I mean, I'm working on a couple of new books that hopefully we'll have out by the end of the year. But one of the greatest compliments that I have gotten from readers, which really I appreciate, is that I've had people write me and say, hey, I really enjoyed reading your book. These are non-Christian people. These are non-religious people. These are, whatever field of whatever walk of life that you would put them in. But I've gotten feedback from them. And they said, I enjoyed the book, and I really appreciated that it wasn't too preachy. And going into this, I wanted to take into the aspect that not everybody who is familiar on some levels with this story or interested in some levels on this story wants to see the hardcore evangelical Christian side of it. They want to be able to look at the story. And hopefully I've presented the book in that fashion. This is my journey through a lot of questions that I had, and I went searching for reasonable answers, and hopefully I've provided some good food for thought for those who would take the time to read it.
Absolutely. I certainly didn't see any preaching in there whatsoever. I mean, from somebody that, whether you're religious or non-religious, it's just put together very well. And yeah, I mean, this is awesome. So once again, hopefully we'll have the opportunity to speak to you again sometime, Mark. I appreciate you joining us here. Thank you, everybody. Stay safe and be the change you want to see. This is Rex Bear. Good night.